Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Georgetown University, to the I Will Lead Me to Law Center for Muslim Christian Understanding, and an event that is really an expression of my own selfish indulgence of my interests. I was very interested in this topic, and I wanted to bring scholars who I thought could provide a comprehensive examination of the issue from three different perspectives, and they all agreed. But I would also like to note, this panel is probably going to be registered on the Not Another All-Male Panel website. I tried to get involvement from, all genders, but unfortunately only the men agreed to be on the panel. So I wasn't even supposed to be here, but I couldn't even find one of my colleagues who would take my place. So I'm the last choice, actually, in terms of moderators and respondents. So anyway, I don't know if that will help the treatment on that website or not, but I did my best. The really, I don't want to spend too much time discussing framing the issue. I would just say that, prior to the Arab Spring in late 2010, early 2011, scholars had been used to talking about Islamic political thought, Islamist movements, Islamic politics in the Middle East. Things had been, I don't know, I hope I'm correct in saying this, fairly static for maybe at least 2 decades. And you heard of established theories, established players, established perspectives. And then that becomes, I guess, completely kind of obliterated with these protests and the fall of several regimes. And all these different thinkers and movements have to reposition themselves, or at least use existing positions to try and make sense of how they're going to act and how they're going to respond to the new stimuli. And then as the Arab Spring tragically fails at least one state after the other with counter-revolutions or increasingly violent civil wars, or all the different fates that these various protest movements encountered, then these scholars, movements, Islamist movements, Islamic activist scholars, establishment scholars, they all have to, again, turn to these different toolkits to try and make sense of what's happening, to position themselves, justify what's happening. And then, of course, you have the rise of ISIS, where you have this completely new injection of thinking about what it means to have Islam and politics interact, and how Muslims act in a political sense in what was very surprising, at least for many people, a surprising turn of events. So these are the things I wanted to discuss, and we have one scholar really, I think, addressing 3 important different issues. One, kind of Islamist movements and from a political science perspective. Second, Islamic scholarship and how Muslim scholars are making sense of legitimacy of states. And finally, theorizing ideas of the caliphate and Islamic political involvement. So I'm going to just introduce each speaker separately as they come up. I think we'll start with Andrew March, right? Oh no, I think we started with Emad, sorry. Emad Shahin, who's visiting professor at Georgetown, the School of Foreign Service. And he is most recently the editor-in-chief of the Oxford Encyclopedia of Islam and Politics, 2 big fat volumes, and also available through OUP's great Oxford Islamic Studies online portal, which I recommend using if any of you have questions about anything involving the Muslim world. He's a professor of public policy at the American University in Cairo. He's currently on leave. I think air quotes are a pretty good way to describe that. Those of you who are interested in that, I'm sure can search for Emad Shahin on the internet, and you'll find out all about his saga in the last couple of years. Emad holds a PhD in 1989 from Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, an MA and a BA from the American University in Cairo. He has taught at leading universities in the United States, including Harvard, Notre Dame, Georgetown. I think Georgetown should have been first, as obviously the most prestigious of these schools. George Washington University and Boston University. His research includes comparative politics, democracy and political reform in Muslim societies, Islam and politics, and the political economy of the Middle East. I also have to add, before Emad speaks, that we have this huge amount of food, and technically it's now lunchtime, 11 a.m., in the broadest sense of the word. So please help yourself. we have to eat all this food, so don't be embarrassed about having seconds or thirds. And Emad, these speakers will have anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes to present, and then we'll have plenty of time for question and answer. So please, Emad, tfaddal.
Thank you, Jack. Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank the Center for Christian-Muslim Understanding for inviting me, of course, and giving me the opportunity to be with you. Speaking about Islamic political thought and the Arab Spring, one main feature of the Arab Spring, of course, has been the hope for change and restoration of dignity. That's what all these popular uprisings have been about. It was also a hope for the building or the establishment of democratic societies and freedoms. However, the narrative has changed since then, from 2011 to 2013. Now the entire region has been facing what Jack referred to as a counter-revolution that has been supported by regional powers, regional forces, autocratic, repressive, most of them, and also by some international forces because, as I mentioned, the narrative has changed from democracy, youth, people power into the restoration of autocratic rulers, ISIS, fighting terrorism, and this kind of, either you are with us or against us discourse once again. It's very important within this kind of actually cloud to stress some positive concepts and values that are still in debate and they are not seasonal, as for example the fight on terrorism and other issues. And one of these, of course, is the issue of democracy and the debate about democracy within Muslim contemporary Islamic political thought. One fact is that the debate about democracy is very old. It predates Glasnost, Perestroika, it predates the collapse of the Soviet Union, it predates even the transformation, the third wave in Europe, and so on. You can date it back to the 19th century with the writings of Islamic reformers, Afghani, Abdu, Muhammad Iqbal, Khairuddin al-Tunsi before them, and Rifa'a al-Tahtawi, who, by the way, in the mid-1800s, translated the French Declaration of the Right of Man and Citizenship. Anyway, so it is an old debate, and the discussion about restricted government, restricted rulers, participation, mashrutiyya, constitution, is very old. If you look even at movements and parties that emerged since the 19th century, and it's very old because there is always an assumption that the Arab world has is missing in terms of a legacy, a democratic legacy. There is no democratic legacy in the Arab world. Actually, the fact is that there has been a relatively long, but weak democratic legacy in the Arab world that dates back to the 19th century. The first constitution in Tunisia, 1860. The first constitution in Egypt, 1866. The first political party in Tunisia in the 19th century is called the Constitution Party. Talks about, the tanzimat that we always keep referring to and other things. Even the constitutional revolt of 1905, 1912 in Iran, and then the Arab revolt and so on, there has been actually again, popular uprising similar to the ones that we see. Because if we take history and move on, 1916, 1921 in Syria, 1936 in Iraq, and different intifadas and upheavals in Palestine and other parts of the world, 1919 in Egypt, there has been always a wave that was calling for self-determination, independence, and some kind of exercise of popular will. I'm not claiming that these were full democratic systems, but at least the concept has always been there And there is no reason to be apologetic or even polemical about this. This has been the fact of political development in the region. The difference is that the call for, there were so many things, deep changes happening at the same time. Colonialism and imperialism taking place, the drive for modernization, the drive for self-determination. These were factors, counter forces that were actually clashing with each other simultaneously. That, of course, was creating a lot of anxiety, a lot of concern, instability in Arab societies. Anyway, there is also another footnote that I'm not going to spend time on, is also the association between the calls for reform, the calls for democratic life, the calls for empowerment and foreign intervention. If you look at this in different time spots, you will find a direct relationship between the desire for self-determination and the immediate intervention of foreign power to quell, to suppress this desire. Look at 1881 in Tunisia, 1882. If you look at, this is a turning point in the Egyptian history. 1882, the Arabi revolt that came, actually one of its top demands was restricted ruler, parliament, representation, and immediately followed and suppressed by British occupation the state for 75 years. And you can take that, if we can really focus or dedicate a research on this, the connection between foreign intervention and the abortion of popular will and for self-determination, you will see this direct relationship. Now, very quick introductory points about misperceptions about democracy and democratic legacy in the region. One, of course, is on the part of the West. Western experience, that this image or this perception about democracy and the place of democracy in the region always stems from a sour experience between America in particular, the West in general, and the Iranian, the Islamic Revolution in Iran. This is one thing. Like always, a popular democratic system, revolutionary system, and so on, is a counter to American interest or Western interest, and always is a bad thing, a negative thing. The second thing is that Arab and Muslim societies are still not ready for democracy. You can see this, I'm talking about these days, I mean we are now in maybe the second decade of the 21st century. You'll see it very clearly in statements like, for example, democracy is not about election. Democracy is about values. Democracy is not about numbers. It's not about majoritarian democracy. It's not about procedural democracy. There is something deeper about democracy. And when you try to look for that thing that is deeper, you will see contradictions and contradictions and contradictions, because you are talking here about social and political engineering of other societies. Unwillingness to accept pluralism, unwillingness to accept diversity even in the democratic expressions and in the democratic experiences. Only Islamists, there is another misperception, only Islamists among all political forces in society, either incumbent regimes, Saudi Arabia, Sisi-like, Ben Ali-like, and so on, are anti-democratic. These are singled out and tested, scrutinized, to see whether they are fully democratic or strategically democratic or tactically democratic. But the ones that are repressive, authoritarian, committing grave violations of human rights are tolerated. Or at best, we express grave concerns about what they are doing. Not out of concern for what's happening and the violations, but out of concern because they are embarrassing us. These are our closest allies, and they shouldn't be behaving this way. Anyway, Islamists also will have the opportunity to win elections if the democratic process goes on. Why? Because they exploit, not because they are good in organization, in addition to also they reflect, translate a popular will that might increase or decrease. And they have the right to participate like anyone else, but because they exploit religious sentiments, because they exploit people's needs, social networks, sugar, cooking oil, they distribute spoils and stuff like that. Islamist assertions also of accepting and adhering to democracy are always doubted and discredited, as I mentioned. Are they tactical or strategic? Even when they step, like Tunisia, for example, we're still doubting Ghanouchi's inner motives. when he, for example, really fought within his party to step down, even though they have the majority. Was that tactical or strategic? And then, of course, finally, I have several points, but just for the sake of time, the process of democratization is counterproductive to Western interests and the stability of Western allies in the Middle East. This is how democracy and the democratic debate from Western perspective to a large extent is perceived. Now, let me just move to the other side, to the Islamists themselves and their way of thinking. Islamists are mainly, I'm talking about now, mainstream Islamists are faced with two big challenges. One is what we call in fiqh and jurisprudence, ta'sil, basing whatever ideas and concepts on fundamentals or within the fundamental principles of Islam and the Sharia. That's the ta'sil, to find roots in a modern expression, to contextualize, synthesize these new or imported concepts like democracy, like parliament, like civil society, like all these kind of imported concepts that do not even have equivalence in translation in Arabic. Like we still call it democracy, ad-dimokratiyya. If you try to translate it, there is no translation. Most of us call it al-barlaman. If you try to translate it, we have to call it majlis. But majlis refers to the majlis of a tribe, refers to anything. It's general, but not actually the parliament as we know as a legislative body. Majlis, sitting. It's a council, it's anything. Anyway, so this is one challenge, and this challenge actually, the challenge of contextualization needs this process of ta'sil, how to build it on fundamental roots of religion, of the Sharia itself, and also popularizing these concepts. If we can just run just show the extent of the challenge of this slide, yes. This is a very primitive rendering of something that looks easy but extremely complicated. It looks at the Muslim society and the social dimension, social system within an Islamic system, Islamic state. And just what I'm trying to show you with this, I will try to explain it very quickly, is to show you that this undertaking of contextualizing, ta'sil, and so on is not an easy one. Why? Because there are two ways of doing this. Either we just push that aside completely, and we just adopt wholesale democracy, globalization, anything that comes to us, socialism, anything that comes to us from the West. This is the easy. To transplant a ready-made model, wholesale, superimpose it, exactly like what the Ben Ali style, the Sisi style, the Mubarak style, superimpose it, and whoever opposes that model, this kind of superimposition, just suppress them very quickly. I mean, like education, media, and so on, brainwash them until they surrender their will and their self-determination. So this is it looks like it looks very simple, but this is a society that's social system based on the concept of enjoining good, forbidding evil. All right. My students usually translate to say, so what? We have it. Good citizenship, citizens' power, fine, but that's something different. That's a duty. That's a moral obligation. That's a religious obligation to enjoin good and forbid evil, and it's a duty and obligation on every single male and female Muslim. And then if you look at the guiding principle of that society, issues of justice, solidarity, organic feeling, moral, mutual obligation, I can see it because it's morality and ethics and equity, all right? These are totally different concepts. Because if you look at, very simply, if you look at Western society, you will put individualism, not equity, but equality, right? You will put the concept of maybe pluralism, totally different concept. They are not, again, they are not contradictory, they are not mutually exclusive. What I'm trying to tell you is, try to place any imported concepts within this kind of paradigm. That's a Muslim paradigm. That's based and founded on, believe it or not, the S word, the Sharia. All right? That it is a part and parcel of Muslim way of life. That's the Sharia. In Egypt, we call it Shara, street. That's way. That's the way of life, the Sharia. Simple. It's not the penal code only. It's not cutting off the hands of the thief. It's not stoning and so on. It is values, doctrines, principles, institutions, practices, that's the Sharia. And maybe, in another occasion, I can just talk about how can you modernize that, the main objective of the Sharia, into a larger paradigm of human capital, human development, human rights, and so on. You can always improvise and you can always innovate on it. How many minutes do I have still? 10 minutes or more? Excellent. All right. So this is one thing. So this is one challenge. How can you? So it's not an easy thing to say. For example, yes, we all believe in democracy. When you find that the principle, or one of the principal values, fundamental values of democracy is citizenship. Correct? There are so many other values: equality, pluralism, sovereignty of the people, and so on. But one of them is citizenship. The core of citizenship is what? Individualism, and compare that to a Muslim value system, where there is always a balance between individualism and communitarianism, or community. There is always this kind of balance. And they are not mutually exclusive. They cannot be mutually exclusive at any rate. So one is, excellent. So one is individualism, and the other one is equality. Muslims look, the value of equality is there, but it's always overshadowed or always superseded by the value of equity. One example. Let's say that we are going to apply equality in a Muslim society that implements the Sharia. No alcohol whatsoever, because every citizen is equal, so Jews, Christians, and so on cannot consume alcohol. That's equality, but that's not equity. Right? And other examples. I can give so many other examples where equality is not really equivalent to equity in a Muslim society. The Sharia takes care of that and recognizes that. The difference between equality, it doesn't mean that it's unequal, but it means it has a particular specific perception of how society is organized. This is the challenge. Not, for example, to say very easily and readily, all right, now the Sharia cannot be implemented unless we implement the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Done. I found the solution. Great. And everybody invites that person everywhere and so on and so forth. Yeah, we'll adopt the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's easy. That's very easy to do. But whether that will take roots in society, whether that reflects the dominant belief system in society, whether that coincides with the genuine practices of society and not an issue of, I give you an example, without mentioning countries, and I have visited these countries. The issue of banning polygamy, I know this is, maybe a bad example because I'll be vulnerable. Banning polygamy in certain countries and so on. So how did Muslim men and women respond to that issue? They get married secretly, second, third wife. They go to the court because a bad neighbor, of course, report them. They go to the court. The husband says, no, she's my mistress. She's not my wife. Okay, innocent. Bye. Outside. All right? There will always be some kind will go around these kind of, superimposed laws and so on. Let me just move on. The second challenge, of course, to Islamists in a democratic society is, and that was very clear after the Arab Spring, how to change from politics to policies. Look at the writings of Sayyid Qutb. Look at the writings of Maududi. Look at the writings of Nabahani, the Islamic Liberation Party, highly political. They wrote 3-4 books about, the principle of Islamic government, the Islamic constitution, the ideal Islamic system. Hassan al-Turabi himself, God bless his soul, when he came to power and then he was ousted and he said, I wrote about, Islamic states so many times. I never knew it would be that difficult to establish an Islamic state. It was almost impossible. Difficult challenge to move from politics, from a mental exercise about a constitution, about the principle of Islamic governance, into policies. How to feed people, how to provide electricity, how to provide gas, how to distribute wealth in society, how to exercise pluralism in society, and so on. Now, I will move very, very quickly, and then And here I'm focusing only on one mainstream, by the way. There are three mainstreams or responses to the issue of democracy. The rejectionist, I'm sure we'll talk about one brand, the jihadist. Also, Mawdudi rejected the concept of democracy. Sayyid Qutb rejected the concept of democracy as alien, imported. And there is a need to give rise to an indigenous concept. They did not stand against the ideals, but against the process itself. That's part of a process of colonization, imperialism, and the desire for building a free, independent, post-colonial society. You see it in Jalal al-Ahmad, in Ali Shariati, in many, a reflection of Frantz Fanon. This phenomenon of third worldism and the emergence of something independent. So the rejectionists, and now of course we come, unfortunately, to the deterioration, intellectual deterioration, as you will see it in ISIS and their ideas. Then the second brand, of course, is those who look at democracy out of expediency. It's not, part of the Islamic system. However, it is good because it will give a chance to propagate, disseminate our ideas, or at least to save ourselves from the repression of regimes. We will recognize that regime, we recognize the political boundaries of that regime, the practices, and they will let us survive. That's the expediency argument. And then the mainstream argument that regards democracy as an ideal system of government, even issuing fatwa to that effect. Qaradawi did the same thing. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, who's, by the way, is listed on the list of terrorism with the Egyptian government and so on, and he's banned from coming here to America and stuff like that, has issued a fatwa considering democracy as an ideal system of government, and voting as a moral and religious obligation, and political parties as part of the religious organization of a Muslim society. So we're talking about these intellectuals who look at democracy as such. Now, very quickly, because I'm really running out of time, 3 or 4 main concepts, main principles that they try to conceptualize. One is, and this is very novel and very dangerous, and many people look at this as extremely controversial, that some Muslim intellectuals are now looking at freedom as the basis of the Sharia. Before monotheism, before belief, before anything. Freedom as the basis of the Sharia. I think this is in the way you understand it. Political freedom, philosophical freedom, free will, voluntarism, that's what they mean by freedom. All the aspects of freedom. Because otherwise, if you are not free, there is no need for Sharia. And Sharia will never take root. You have to have this freedom of choice. Freedom of will. So they consider this as a prerequisite and more important than the Sharia. This is the ideas of Abbasi Madani of Algeria. He has a whole book about this. This is the ideas of Qaradawi later, because the first one I read about these ideas in his writings was Abbasi Madani. He's in Qatar now and he's gone, Algerian intellectual. And he was the head of the FIS, the Islamic Salvation Front. And then Sayyid Qutb, Yusuf al-Qaradawi also talks about freedom as a basis. Raisuni, Ahmad al-Raisuni, jurist Ahmad al-Raisuni of Morocco, all of them talk about freedom as the beginning of even doctrine and so on. If you look at Ghanouchi's rendering of an Islamic state, it rests on very fundamental concepts. One is public freedoms. Al-Hurriyat al-Amma fi al-Dawla al-Islamiyya. One of his masterpieces. Public freedoms in the Islamic state. I translated. Public freedoms in the Islamic state. He talks about the blueprint of an Islamic state in comparison to Western systems. A fantastic book. That was his dissertation. And we scholars know that usually PhD dissertation is the best, or usually comes as the best book. All right? So, and he couldn't defend it, of course. He had to go into exile and so on. So it's public freedoms, citizenship. He wrote prolifically about citizenship, decentralization, and non-intrusive state. This is all in the books, the classical books of Islam. The Islamic state is the least intrusive state. I know this sounds very counterintuitive, but it's the least intrusive state. I will move very quickly. The second concept, of course, is, because I have here a listing of the main principles of his perception of a state. Then the second one is, of course, the second concept is the state in Islam is a democratic republican system. A democratic republican system. It doesn't sound like news to you, but this is based on what? This is the contextualization. Abu Ya'rib al-Marzuqi, another Tunisian philosopher, he's not very well known in the West, but he's one of the few philosophers in the Arab world. He talks about the Islamic state as a republican democratic. Amr al-Jama'ah plus the affairs of the community, republican, plus shura. And he insists that it's not the affairs of the jurists, it's not the affairs of the rulers, but the affairs of the community itself. The third one is citizenship as the basis of the political community. Citizenship as this is, of course, you'll see it in the writing of Ghannouchi, in the writing of Tariq al-Bishri, in the writing of Muhammad Salim al-Awa, Fahmi Huwaidi, where they try, and the major conclusion here is the state of dhimma, the state of protected communities, has been a historical condition that has ended. In modern time, it has ended. It has been replaced by citizenship. Equal citizens on equal basis. That's a major ijtihad. And I think it opens the door for equal participation of the members of the community. Finally, rationalism as the basis of Islamic liberalism, as an inalienable, this rationalism as an inalienable value, and the basis of any Islamic democratic system. You find it in the writings of Abdul Karim Soroush, Mohsen Kadivar, that they insist on these concepts. The idea of reason and freedom, intertwined as a dynamic behind any conception of or conceptualization of an Islamic polity. I will just, focus on another jurist that's not known in the West, but he's very well respected in the Muslim circles, Sheikh Ahmed al-Raisuni of Morocco. He's a jurist, and he is the head of the main movement or the main group of Justice and Development Party in Morocco, Tawheed wal-Islah, Unity and Reform movement. So he's like the ideologue of that movement, and he talks about the possibility of adopting concepts, ideas, and principles of democracy without necessarily transplanting wholesale its own particular experience in a specific place or a specific time. This again sounds, like, so what? But this is very important. Why important? Because this shows you a willingness to accept diversity, pluralism on the part of Muslim jurists and not reciprocated by Western philosophers or thinkers who look at democracy as an essentialized concept. Essentialized like wholesale. You cannot tell me, for example, I will take this part of democracy and leave that part. I know this is very controversial, but there are some kind of connections with democracy that still needs to be validated. For example, the connection between democracy and secularism. Definitely, that has to be validated. And now we hear people say, well, yes, yes, United Kingdom, yes, the Queen is the head of the church. Yes, the Norwegian constitution requires that the king is a Protestant. Imagine if the constitution of Egypt requires, for example, as the Norwegian constitution, that 50% of government members have to be Protestant. You will invade Egypt tomorrow. Thank you. You will invade Egypt tomorrow. And that's the Norwegian constitution. And nobody, everybody, it's a surprise. Oh, really? Our constitution says that? Yes, your constitution says that. That the king has to be Protestant. And 50% of the government has to be Protestant. Not a single Arab constitution, Muslim institution states that the caliph or the head of the, Egypt and so on should be Muslim, or 50% should be Muslim. Anyway, so this idea of de-essentializing democracy, the same way that people here in the West, like if you read Bassam Tibi and others, calling for the de-essentialization of the Sharia. The Sharia has been de-essentialized for hundreds of years. What's left now is the personal status code. The Sharia that I was referring to as a way of life. The way of life is gone. What is there? Only the personal status code and part of the personal status code. And they are targeting this as well to be erased from Muslim societies. Let me just, I have again, you know, in specific, the commonalities between all mainstream Muslim intellectuals in their perception of democracy, the nature of authority and power, but I will conclude here because I think I made my points with the Arab Spring. And this is, I think, very important because it deals with our future, the future of the region and so on, and all this, you know, like, again, fallacies about fighting terrorism with autocrats and fighting terrorism with authoritarian with authoritarian partners and so on. After the Arabs, the counter-revolution, the Arab Spring, three responses emerged, of course, about what happened. 2011, as I started, was, you know, like really brought hope, expectations and youthful things and, you know, people power and stuff like that. Now it's totally different story. We're even concerned about the safety, the coherence of statehoods. Like if you look what happened after the Arab Spring, and it's not because of the Arab Spring, it's because of failing the Arab Spring and failing people's aspirations, as I alluded to earlier. We have three responses. One, of course, several Islamic parties adhered to more democracy, believe it or not. Like they saw the counterattack against democracy, so they adhered to more democracy. Tunisia. If you look at Tunisia in terms of details, look at Egypt and how Egypt was brought down, the revolution was brought down, and the counter-revolution won, and what happened in Tunisia, it's like carbon copy, for no need. Like Egypt, you have the Salvation, National Salvation Front. In Tunisia, you have the National Salvation Front emerging at some point. Threats with withdrawal from constituent assemblies and all this, and boycotting the process entirely from the liberals and seculars. The same thing happened. Tamarrud in Egypt, in Tunisia. And then the response was what? Adhere more to democracy in Tunisia. And that was, of course, the work of al-Nahda and the work of Islamists, Rashid Ghannouchi, and the Troika, of course, and different parties in Tunisia. So you have Tunisia, you have Morocco. The government, the incumbent government, cabinet in Morocco is an Islamist government. It's not always bleak, by the way. Like the Islamists have failed, and there is no future for political Islam. There is a future for political Islam in different parts of the Islamic world. It is ruling in Turkey, it is ruling in Morocco, and it's ruling in different parts of the Islamic world. Now, so Algeria, the same thing, more commitment to democracy, Hamsan and other groups and so on. Now, so that was one response. You fight the threat to democracy not by sleeping or going in bed with autocrats, the old ways. No, you fight the threat to democracy by more democracy. That's how you safeguard democracy. I know it sounds counterintuitive, but that's what you do here. Look what's happening. I mean, you could have Trump as president. Exactly, it is democracy. It comes with risks. What you need is to build a system that safeguards democracy. Not an autocrat, not the military, not anybody. The institutions themselves are the best safeguards for democracy. That was denied in the Arab world and the Arab Spring. The second response, some parties, of course, and organizations lost control. They were dealt a severe blow. The Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Islamists in Syria, they got off ground because of the massive crackdown on that movement that even caused that movement to split. What's the use of democracy? We played by the rules. Look what happened to us. How do you want leaders? How do you want us? And this is actually the current debate within the Muslim Brotherhood. It's not generational because the generations are actually divided along the two divides or sides. One side is advocating the old way of survival. Let's just compromise. Let's just seek political reconciliation. And one side is calling for revolutionary path. Let's push forward. Violent, even violent. Let's push forward. What's the use of democracy? What gains did we get from democracy and following them? Then the third one that, of course, my colleagues, and I will conclude with this, will talk about is the whole validation of the radicals. Look, we told you so. We told you. These regimes, these, like the kind of behind-the-scene powers will never allow people power and people's will to take place and materialize. They will always fight you, because that's the essence of the struggle in that region. No self-determination and no expression of general and public will. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Dr. Emad. The second speaker, and this is just, I think the fact that he doesn't have his PhD yet just goes to show how he's not relying on his credentials. It's his brain power. Usaama al-Azami is a doctoral candidate at Princeton University in the Department of Near Eastern Studies. He completed his BA in Arabic and Islamic Studies at the University of Oxford and spent several years studying the Middle East prior to 2009. His dissertation studies the acquisition of, as well as the opposition to, liberal ideas in contemporary Sunni political thought. The third part of his dissertation focuses on the impact of the Arab revolutions on Islamic scholarly discourses in the region. And he also occasionally blogs on Islam and political affairs on the Huffington Post. And the reason I wanted Usaama to come is because he follows so closely the current debates amongst Muslim scholars about issues of politics and political legitimacy. So anytime I ever want to know anything about it, I ask him, because he's managed to keep his finger on this pulse much better than I would ever have time or ability to do. So thanks very much, Usaama, for coming.
Thank you very much, Jack, for having me. It's really an extraordinary honor to be on such an august panel with scholars I admire, not least Jack himself.
But not most either.
So I've got a slideshow. This is an earlier version of the slideshow. There were slight tweaks I made, and I'll make them as I go along, just to sort of have a bit of a balanced discussion. Firstly, you've got Islamic Political Thought in the Arab Revolutions, the title of the talk, but instead of putting scholarly discourses from 2011 to the present, I actually sort of redid that and said scholars' discourses, because some of the discourses aren't very scholarly, unfortunately. So just please bear with me on that. So just some background, and Professor Shahin kindly sort of did that in a great deal of detail, so I'll just kind of do a summary. So in the 20th century, democracy gradually established itself as a political norm in Western societies. As it did so, it also was incorporated into Christian theology in some denominations more readily than others. An analogous shift has been taking place in Islamic discourses, and this has been studied by scholars for several decades by this point. In the Arab world, which the scholarly discourses, the secondary scholarship talks about, it's lagging behind other parts of the world, indeed other parts of the Muslim world as well. There has been a systematic development of a pro-democracy legal and theological discourse. And we saw some snippets in Professor Shahin's talk. And I think he mentioned very importantly that this does go back over 100 years. So you have people like Rashid Rida, you have people like, I forget, Khairuddin al-Tunisi. So it's not just the last 30 years, but I'm speaking specifically about Islamists at this point. Islamists also developed after Qutb and after Maududi, who were quite qualified or rejectionist with respect to democracy. They also developed an indigenization of democracy into their discourses, and that really sort of represented the mainstream of Islamist discourses at the point that we had the Arab revolutions. And so, as I mentioned, this has been studied by a number of scholars, and in the secondary literature you have people like Gudrun Kramer, John Voll, and a host of others. And in the primary sources, it's people like Qaradawi, Tawfiq al-Shawi, Rashid Ghannouchi, who we had a look at. And let me just quickly define what I mean by an Islamist. And that, incidentally, is I took it from The Economist with credit. That's the current state of play in the region. And you can see sort of certain places are full autocracies. Some places, the only democracy, as you can see, is Tunisia. There was a bit of controversy on the internet, I think, when they did this, because they didn't show Israel as a democracy in the region. But the only democracy in the Arab world is Tunisia. And that more or less is the current state of affairs. But let me define the word Islamist. I'm talking about Muslims who are socially and politically activist in their bent, and who want their religion to have a wider impact, including on society, including in the political realm. Now, that's the background for the Islamists with respect to the Arab Spring. And when the Arab Spring took place, this discourse really remained a theoretical one in most Muslim countries. People like Rashid Ghannouchi living in exile in London, and abortive efforts by people like Hassan al-Turabi. And so it really broadly remained an untested theory for Islamists. Cue the Arab revolutions, and kind of suddenly what seemed impossible for decades suddenly seemed realizable. So that's the pro-democratic discourses. And it's worth emphasizing the people who are leading the pro-democratic discourses in the Muslim world, in the Arab Muslim world, are Islamists. In that context, you also have, being an autocratic milieu, you had establishment scholarship, which was very much in favor of autocracy. Some of these scholars, even if they were sort of in favor of democracy, the democratic Islamists may not have been establishment figures. They may not have been central figures in the Azhar in a place like Egypt, but they still had a lot of popularity. With respect to the non-Islamist figures, they simply avoided sort of discussing political matters prior to the Arab Spring. And after the Arab Spring, the sort of discourse was very much focused on the legitimacy of the autocratic regimes. And I'll be looking at certain specific figures and seeing what they have to say about sort of the legitimacy of autocracy, or the legitimacy specifically in Egypt of the coup, for example. As I say, a lot of this discourse is not really thought in the traditional sense. They don't write books about these sorts of things. They just sort of come and make statements or give talks justifying the current autocratic status quo. Among the things that they say is that there's a rejection of democracy as un-Islamic, that their discourse is focused on ta'atul amir, what's called sort of like obedience to the rulers. And the Islamic tradition itself, incidentally, has elements that could both justify that sort of quietist obedience towards one's rulers, but also an activist sort of trend. And one of the things that a lot of sort of the post-counter-revolution scholars in favor of Arab autocrats emphasize is that the Islamic tradition is really just a tradition of obedience to autocrats or obedience to rulers. There's no room for anything else. Thankfully, in the English language, we have the excellent book by Khalid Abul Fadl called Rebellion in Islamic Law, published in 2001, where he sort of maps the enormous variety in outlooks when it came within the Sharia in Islamic history, when it came to how one deals with unjust rulers. Does one have the obligation to be quietist, or does one have the opportunity and the option of becoming oppositional towards those sorts of unjust autocrats? And so, that's one of the things that the sort of scholars who are in favor of, and I should actually pull the next slide up. So I mentioned some of the I said pro-Islamic democracy, but one of the ways I wanted to actually present it was they were anti-coup scholars. And these are two senior figures in the sort of Islamist scholarly universe. Yeah, specifically the Egyptian coup, I apologize, of 2013. So that's Rashid Ghannouchi on the left and Yusuf Qaradawi on the right. And then these are the scholars, I've put them as pro-Sisi scholars. I was going to do that as pro-coup scholars. So you have, these are three figures who've become very sort of prominent in Egyptian in the Egyptian media landscape. Even though the far left figure is actually a Yemeni scholar, but he's extremely close to the figure in the middle, Ali Jum'a, also pronounced Gum'a in the Egyptian dialect, and Usaama as-Sayyid. So I'm going to actually now switch to some of their sort of conversations and some of their discourses in the Egyptian revolution, or after the Egyptian coup of 2013. So the Arab revolutions ended up providing the opportunity for an Islamic democratic experiment, but the democratic experiment in Egypt was obviously a very serious threat to the ancien regime. So eventually, the sort of revolutionary fervor and the democratic movement succumbed to a coup in 2013. And in the post-revolutionary context, or the post-coup context, these establishment figures started speaking in very strong terms in favor of the Sisi regime, and very sort of virulent in their condemnation of the Islamists. And so what is the substance of their thought? I wanted to sort of highlight. Firstly, I would say Ali Jum'a and the others, they play up the idea of fealty to Egypt as a nation state, and in particular the Egyptian army. And Ali Jum'a had, a number of extensive sort of presentations in front of the Egyptian armed forces. Among these presentations, he had a series of quotes from sort of prophetic traditions, which are transmitted, which scholars of prophetic traditions considered for the most part to be fabricated and not to be sort of authentic. But these basically were traditions that highlighted the greatness of the Egyptian army. It was a certain, it was laughable to a lot of people who were well-read in the field, but it's also the fact that he's taking something which was stated apparently 1400 years ago and said it's talking about Egypt today. So talking about the importance of the Egyptian army and the fact that the Egyptian army can never be wrong, essentially. And therefore it was absolutely an obligation for people to sort of obey the Egyptian army. Now, I've actually just realized I wanted to show a couple of clips, but unfortunately I didn't get in time, get those clips to the people, so I'll do the quotations myself. The other thing is the prohibition, the absolute prohibition on rebellion, which I spoke about in passing, and perhaps quite strikingly, the absolute right of killing protesters in Egypt. So Ali Jum'a is famously, I'll read the quote at length, but famously he said, "Shoot to kill," to the army. And he said this prior the Rabaa massacre in a sort of private recording done for the Shu'un al-Ma'nawiyya lil-Jaysh al-Masri, the sort of spiritual affairs of the Egyptian armed forces. And then afterwards he also said this, he reiterated this on the 18th of August. So let me speak briefly about the Rabaa massacre. For those of you who don't know, unfortunately I don't have a slide for it. Maybe that's better, actually. It was very gruesome, unfortunately. So Rabaa massacre was something which took place. It was the clearing of the protesters. There were tens of thousands of protesters in various squares in the Cairene capital. And Human Rights Watch described it as the sort of largest massacre in modern Egyptian history of civilians. Over 1,000 people, according to Human Rights Watch, Human Rights Watch's estimate, over 1,000 people were killed, mostly unarmed. So Human Rights Watch's research said that there was evidence for about 5 or 10 sort of weapons in the sort of in the squares, but over 1,000 people were killed. And Ali Jum'a famously said in his lecture on the 18th of August 2013. So I'm going to quote a few things from the lecture. He famously said, "Shoot to kill." But the other thing about the lecture is, and the general discourse about the post-revolutionary context was that, okay, sorry, that was the, oops, Okay, that's the Arab revolutions. Okay, this is okay. So this is the picture in the middle is a bit unfortunate, but the translation is, this is how a lot of people responded to the way Ali Jum'a spoke to the military. They called him the Mufti al-Askar, or the Mufti of the military. And they said something which is quite true in the subtitle, which is he permits the killing of those opposing the coup and deems them khawarij, or rebels, which is a highly charged term. I've got 5 minutes maybe, or I've got, okay, please let me know how I'm doing for time. So in terms of the quotes, on the 18th of August 2013, Ali Jum'a spoke to the sort of Egyptian armed forces. This was televised in Egypt. It's also on his official YouTube page, so he's got nothing to hide. He's actually quite proud of it very clearly. And it was ironically a talk called Samahatul Islam, the sort of like generosity and the tolerance of Islam. And in it, initially to the army, he said, so it's obviously a very long talk, it's about 40 minutes. It's worth watching, and I've translated it, and I'll hopefully have it up on my academia page soon enough. But he said to the army unequivocally that you are on the right path, you know, you're on the haqq, to use sort of like theologically loaded language. And about the protesters, he said, blessed are those who kill them. Okay, so طُوبَى لِمَنْ قَتَلَهُمْ وَقَاتَلُوا. So, I mean, now this isn't really political thought, but it does, it is the implications of certain political thought, and I'll go into that in a moment. He described them as khawarij, okay, and the khawarij are a group that emerged in early Islam who opposed the mainstream of the Muslims and considered them to be legitimate to kill. Okay, so the peaceful protesters of the Rabaa who were, 99.9% unarmed, according to Human Rights Watch, were somehow sort of compared with rebels in early Islam who would go and kill average Muslims. Now, this was not just a description of what was going on. That's quite obviously not the case. It was also part of a sort of effort to, on the part of the state, to taint the image of anyone who was against the coup. And what's interesting about the religious tradition about, with respect to the Khawarij, or the rebels of the early period, is that the mainstream actually was extremely tolerant of them. Okay, and this is discussed in, among other people's work, Khalid al-Fadl. So Ali, who was the fourth caliph, who dealt with the Khawarij, was actually extremely sort of like lenient towards them. And so he calls them the Khawarij, and he says, and the Khawarij are the dogs of the hellfire. So these people are the dogs of the hellfire, the people who you are fighting. So in a sense, it's sort of diminishing their moral capacity in order to make it legitimate to go ahead and kill them. And then this is maybe more of a justification, which could be seen as plausible by some. So he was saying, killing more right now effectively prevents further killing. I will kill 100 in order to save 1,000. Okay. So, I mean, that was, and this would come under maslaha, which I will talk about briefly after this. So the idea that, in the public interest, we have to take the lesser of two evils, and that was the. But then there's the quote against Yusuf al-Qaradawi, and this shows that, so Yusuf al-Qaradawi is this figure on the right. Yusuf al-Qaradawi was one of the early figures who, in the Muslim world, he's a very prolific author, and he was very much in favor of the revolutions. Perhaps the most significant sort of publicly known scholar who was pro-revolution. About Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he had some very low blows to make. And I just want to sort of like show that this isn't really political thought. It's more at times about sort of character assassination. So he said, this person, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he didn't mention him by name, he just sort of alluded to something he did, who came out yesterday and said the army of the Jews is better than the Egyptian army. He actually said that after Rabaa happened, he said, even the Egyptian army doesn't massacre us in this sort of, even the Israelis don't massacre sort of Muslims in Gaza in this way. He said, this person who came out and said the army of the Jews is better than the army of Egyptian army, he is a kafir. And this is he's using a sort of double entendre. Kafir means someone who's a disbeliever, okay, but it also means someone who's rejects. And then immediately he says, kafirun bi ni'matillah. He rejects God's bounty. In fact, he rejects God's intent. So he's sort of being very sort of clever in the way he's playing with the language here. In fact, I would not wish to say we should ignore him. Rather, we should purify our city and our Egypt of these low lives. The term he used was awbash. They do not deserve our Egyptian identity. We are disgraced in our association with them. So this is the sort of language that he used on the 18th in front of the Egyptian armed forces. Now, one of the things I want to highlight here is the main point of attack of ISIS, or one of the main points of attack of ISIS when it comes to the broader Sunni or even the global Muslim community beyond Sunnism, is that they engage in what's known as takfir, or declaring other Muslims to be kafirs or disbelievers. And what you have here is one of the lead figures of the Egyptian sort of establishment, who has also been a signatory of the letter to al-Baghdadi, or a signatory of a letter of Muslim scholars against ISIS, is engaged in analogous behavior in many respects. He also, and again, I apologize that I'm using this sort of language, but I'm actually just translating. He calls Qaradawi a compulsive liar, a slanderer, someone who suffers from Alzheimer's, and indirectly he calls him a dog. He says, you don't listen to his barking. Okay. And so, these are fairly low blows, and so it's not really, I've written here, this is why it's difficult to call this thought, so to speak. It's not really political thought. But it does frame the way in which there's a certain cavalier attitude to thought when it comes to the intellectual justifications. A lot of it does seem like an afterthought. And so let me do the final sort of quote. And it says, we fight, but we're not killing. So he made a distinction between fighting and killing, saying they're the killers. We're not the killers. They're the ones who expose themselves to that, meaning to being killed by us. Therefore, these rebels, Khawarij, if a single shot is fired from their side, whether it comes from them or from those who are joining them but are not of them, or from their direction, if a single shot is fired, then shoot to kill. Okay, so this is what he said on the 18th. So this is someone obviously who's entirely sort of like comfortable with the mass killings that took place in the Rabaa massacre, which really sort of raises questions of, this was, I should have given this background earlier, he was the former Mufti of Egypt, and he only sort of stopped being so because they have mandatory retirement ages in Egypt. And he's the closest of the Egyptian religious establishment to the Sisi regime. And I wanted to actually play a clip, but I haven't got it. But I wanted to play a clip of another figure, Arif al-Naid, who's an interesting figure who connects this to the UAE. And, I've been talking about scholarly discourses, but this really needs to be framed within the geopolitics of the region. And one of the things that Arif al-Naid does, and he's actually an Anglophile, sorry, not an Anglophile, but he speaks English. Anglophone, sorry. So he's an Anglophone scholar, and he is the Libyan ambassador to the UAE. He was implicated, he was mentioned in the New York Times late last year as being implicated in being part of the scandal that rocked the UN envoy to Libya. And he's basically, in a sense, he's the Libyan ambassador to the UAE, but he's the UAE's man in Libya. The UAE has been a very sort of, the United Arab Emirates has been a very important player in the supporting of the autocrats in the regime. And in a sense, these scholars are really functioning, those who are sort of pro-coup or in favor of the Egyptian coup are very much functioning, I think, at the beck and call of these regimes often. But Arif al-Naid, he basically is making an effort. In a CNN interview he gave early last year after he wrote an op-ed on a similar subject, he basically said, the Muslim Brotherhood and ISIS are identical. They all draw from Sayyid Qutb's thought, and Sayyid Qutb was a takfiri, or someone who promoted sort of calling Muslims unbelievers, I suppose in the way that we just saw Ali Jum'ah did. And so this has been one of the sort of aspects of the entire move in sort of pro-coup scholarly discourse. It has been to cast the Muslim Brotherhood as basically the same as ISIS. That's what they really believe in. That's what they really want. And it's not really a very sort of meaningful discourse for anyone who is familiar with the scholarship. And anyone who's interested, I really recommend reading Barbara Zollner's work on the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology, published by Routledge, I forget when. But she basically demonstrates that the refutation of Sayyid Qutb took place within the ranks of the Muslim Brotherhood in the 60s and 70s. Okay, so Sayyid Qutb and the people who authored that refutation, Hassan Hudaybi being the person who had his main name on it, the people who authored that refutation were the people who later became Umar Tilmisani and Mamun Mustafa Mashur, I believe, and others were involved in that, according to many of the scholars who study it. They became the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood afterwards, so that they kind of defined the identity of the Muslim Brotherhood. So Qutbism, in its more extreme guises, which has been blamed for certain trends towards extremism, was institutionally rejected by the Muslim Brothers and at an early stage, and really didn't play any role at a later stage. And this is where I wanted to bring in Usaama al-Azhari. That was Mufti al-Jum'ah. Usaama al-Sayyid al-Azhari is a figure who is a young student of Ali Jum'ah. And again, in early 2015, he wrote an Orwellianly titled work against the Muslim Brothers. So it's called Al-Haqqul Mubin fi Raddi ala man tala'aba bid-din. And I was sort of wondering if he was talking about himself. But he wrote a book called The Manifest Truth as a refutation of those who play with the religion. And the subtitle says, I can't read the Arabic here, but the extreme trends from the Muslim Brotherhood to Daesh in the scholarly balance. So sort of an assessment of the Muslim Brotherhood and Daesh. And this is part of the effort to cast these as part of all of the same. I mean, I don't want to sort of suggest that the Muslim Brotherhood is completely pro-democracy. There's a very healthy scholarly discourse in the Western secondary literature which talks about the challenges of liberal democracy versus Islamic democracy, and Professor Shahin would be far better than me to discuss that if people are interested. I just as a summary, and I don't really have a great deal of time, I spoke about the maslaha component. That much of the scholarly discourse of the people who were in favor of the coup is grounded on the notion that this is better for Egypt. Okay, Sisi is better for Egypt, and occasionally it's difficult to find it in their own words. But people who know them, and I actually know a lot of the people who I've been I've met almost everyone I've had photos of up there. These people and people who are around them, people who are their students, very often will say more explicitly, actually, this is more about the fact that the Muslim Brotherhood were just dangerous for Egypt. And some of the language that is used here, it strikes me as somewhat irrational and paranoid. There's the sort of language that says, the Muslim Brotherhood were going to destroy Egypt. There were some people say things like the Muslim Brotherhood was in cohorts with Israel trying to destroy Egypt, which just sounds a bit funny to me. And that the New York Times and the Human Rights Watch were all propaganda arms of the Muslim Brotherhood, or that they didn't know, anything about Rabaa, and obviously Ali Jum'ah being someone who's in Egypt knows the sort of the details of what's actually going on. So that is in a sense a summary of the discourse on that side. The pro-democracy discourse, I think, is going through really a lot of turmoil in the post-revolutionary period, but I'm not an expert on that, and Dr. Shahin seems to know these people better than I do. What does the future have in store? I think anyone who studies the history of revolutions knows that these things take a long time. I think we had the famous case is obviously the French Revolution, and we had Napoleon Bonaparte within a decade or so. And so France under one king became France under one empire. But I think that predicting precisely what's going to happen in the future is not the task of scholars, but of prophets. And for now, I think the people who are democratic activists in the region will have to be content with playing the long game. Thank you very much.
can't find my introductory sheet, but I'm going to see if I can do Andrew's bio from memory. Andrew March is an associate professor of political science at Yale, and almost as good a school as Georgetown. He's also an associate professor adjunct of law there. And he's the author of a very good book, Islam and Liberal Citizenship, 2009, which I really recommend. It's an excellent resource. It's a really excellent resource. And sometimes when I'm too lazy to read it, I email Andrew and say, what page do you discuss this issue on? And he's also written a lot of articles on Islamic political thought. I think if you are interested in issues like freedom of speech, blasphemy, can Islamic thought be liberal? How would you compare different schools of thought within liberalism to Islamic thought? Andrew's written so many excellent articles on these topics that are all on his, what's it called, SSRN page? That's what they're called, right? So, if you just Google his name and a lot of these topics, you'll find, I think, probably the best things written on them. And this is the question that we were talking about earlier. Usaama is presently working on a book on sovereignty and modern Islamic thought entitled The Caliphate of Man. So please, thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank you, Jack, for the invitation. Thank you, everyone, for coming, the organizers, and very, very happy to be here. I just want to get my own timer going on here so I don't force Jack to do too much work. For decades, as the previous two speakers have noted, groups in the broad orbit of the mainstream Islamist movement not only distinguish themselves from groups like al-Qaeda or other violent rejectionists, not only by their relative moderation or flexibility on social and legal questions, but also on their vision of political and legal change through institutional mechanisms. During these decades, various theoretical and ideological visions of the potential reconciliation of Islamic ideals with all aspects of modern state institutions had been put forward. The mainstream Islamist movement, of course, included a wide spectrum of ideological views, but the most important premise was that Islamists could come to power and achieve their goals within the form and structure of existing nation states. The quote-unquote so-called Islamic State followed Sisi's destruction of the Muslim Brotherhood with a resounding and unambiguous response to this long-standing Islamist premise. There is nothing legitimate or redeemable about modern state forms, boundaries, or procedures. There is nothing Islamic about parliamentary elections or codified positive law. All existing states ruling tyrannically over Muslims must be smashed, and a new revival of the Muslim Ummah will radiate out of the liberated territories in the former Iraq and Syria, which now form the core of a renewed caliphate in the prophetic model. It was as if the revolutions of 1848 in Europe had been followed both by a conservative authoritarian reaction as well as an armed movement out of Rome, preaching papal plenitudo potestatis over secular and religious affairs, promising to turn back the tide of the French Revolution, the Enlightenment, the Reformation, and the investiture controversy, and fomenting armed revolt throughout Europe and perhaps Georgetown, with scattered liberated provinces declaring themselves faithful to the sovereign pontiff. For decades, Islamist scholars, jurists, theologians, and preachers theorized the Islamic State with very little reference to the office of the caliphate. In fact, many of them, from the Pakistani father of political Islam, Maududi, to the Tunisian Rashid al-Ghanouchi, had posited that the true meaning of the vicegerency or caliphate of God, spoken of in such verses of the Quran as 230, was that the entire Muslim Ummah, or perhaps mankind at large, has been deputized with God's authority on earth. While the notion of a restored political office representing the unity of the Muslim community was never dismissed as a point of doctrine or long-term aspiration, it was not seen as an imminent prospect, nor as a precondition for the pursuit of more immediate ideological reforms in existing Muslim states. It was the Salafi movement that insisted on the restoration of the office as an indispensable creedal matter, and it is the debates and discourses of the militarized wing of this movement where the claims issuing today from Raqqa and Mosul have their roots. The rise of the Islamic State has occasioned an explosion of theological and juridical argument about the understanding of the caliphate. Islamic State-affiliated scholars or propagandists have produced a range of texts in defense of the caliphate's legal constitutional foundation. Some of these texts, anticipating the caliphal pretensions of the Islamic State of Iraq, were produced up to a year before the declaration of the caliphate. I don't need to list them at the moment. After the declaration of the caliphate on June 29, 2014, almost a year to the date of the Egyptian coup, a further spate of texts have appeared, again, further elaborating the juridical and theological premises. Many of the texts issued by groups upon giving their allegiance to the Islamic State have also been published, as have the Islamic State's own guidelines for giving bay'ah or pledging allegiance. In response, a number of mainstream, read non-Salafi jihadi scholars have issued denunciations not only of the Islamic State's many horrific acts of violence, but also their claims to have restored the caliphate. But perhaps the most vociferous and detailed challenges to the Baghdadi caliphate come from al-Qaeda-affiliated scholars and propagandists, as well as some associated with the Taliban. The traditional lodestar of this world, the Jordanian scholar Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, published a refutation of the declaration of the caliphate in July 2014. Further refutations have been issued by other Salafi jihadi publicists in the orbit of al-Qaeda, including Abu Qatada al-Filistini, Iyad al-Qunaybi, Abu al-Mundhir al-Shinqiti, Hussein bin Mahmoud, and many, many others. They were eventually grouped together in a 2015 book entitled What They Said About Baghdadi's State, clearly not a caliphate. Thus, since at least June 2014, the question of the caliphate has once again been thrust to the forefront of debates about legitimacy, sovereignty, and institutionalism in the transnational Islamic public sphere. What is at stake in these contemporary debates for legal and political theorists? The concept of the caliphate in Islam, whether understood as an office or as a status, is at the center of Islamic legal theorizing about sovereignty. These debates are particularly interesting because of the centrality, depth, and comprehensiveness of law and legality in Islamic visions of political life. I use those three adjectives deliberately. Law is central to most Islamic visions of political life. Political questions tend to be formed as juridical questions, and juridical answers have particular force and prestige. Law is assumed to run deeply in Islamic political life, even in pre-political moments, and this is the main theme of my reflections today, even in pre-political moments that in other visions might be seen as states of war or states of exception, law is not silent. Law is thus also comprehensive. It may speak with more or less precision and determinacy, but it is never unable to provide some framework or guidance. But what does this have to do with the question of the caliphate? The caliph in Sunni Islamic constitutional theory is not a Hobbesian sovereign. He does not embody or create the body politic, does not enjoy absolute legislative sovereignty, and is limited in his adjudicative powers. Still less does he have charismatic powers of healing or embodying the divine in other ways, the way that medieval, but more importantly, early modern European monarchs were seen to. But the office is central to the idea of legality in Islam. This is the case in at least two ways. First, a sitting recognized caliph is seen as the font of legitimacy of all further delegated offices, especially judges. Second, and more interesting for present purposes, the establishment and filling of the office is seen as legally regulated. But here things get complicated. What is the precise relationship between law and procedural legality on the one hand, in will, force, decision, and success on the other? How strong of an impediment to power is law supposed to be? How does a legal order get off the ground in the first place in moments of abeyance or exception? In short, what is the relationship between idealism and realism in Islamic political and legal thought? Apart from these questions about foundings, origins, and constitutions are questions about the operation of a legal order. How does a pre-political, divinely instituted law preserve its force in a world of change? What does it mean to speak of the sovereignty of law in a political system that acknowledges the need for judgment, discretion, and will? Is it helpful to see the problem of sovereignty in a nomocratic regime as a matter not only of the right to represent and execute the law in political life, but also of the right to act in the sphere of temporal, political judgment, and above all, the right to decide on the boundary between these two forms of law, the Sharia law and the law of siasa or discretionary judgment, both where that boundary lies and when the very problem of that boundary is salient or rather suspended. So thus, the concept of the caliphate is intrinsic to any discussion of the problem of sovereignty in Islamic thought, which has only in the past century become explicit and self-conscious. My talk today is premised on the idea that the rise of the Islamic State phenomenon has, whatever its horrors and whatever its detriment to Islamic political thought, has first of all raised a very, very complicated discourse about the meaning and the foundations of the caliphate, and has brought back to the forefront this as a vision of Islamist energy as opposed to the constitutional Islamist project that had been developed for the decades between Qutb and 2011. I want to very briefly frame this in terms of a debate, really in contrast with the debate that happened in the 1920s. This, in my view, was the last time that the foundations of the caliphate were argued in public with any kind of urgency. So this, of course, was the period when the caliphate was abolished by the Turkish parliament. And this is a sort of a liminal or boundary period between the kind of a certain phase of Islamic modernity where, as Professor Shahin mentioned, many thinkers were devoted to the project of developing Islamic constitutions in Tunisia, in Egypt, in the Ottoman Empire, in Persia, and where the idea of constitutionalism was not by and large seen as in conflict or in contradiction with Islam, but nor was the notion of any kind of need to justify Islam in terms of Western conceptions of democracy particularly salient. So there was a kind of elite conception of Islamic constitutionalism whereby constitutionalism was seen as a kind of Sharia rule of law whereby the executive rulers will be held to account by law, by the Sharia, but where power was still seen to be shared between the executive apparatus of the Sultan and the amorphous group of scholars and notables that collectively constitute the people who loose and bind. So this was not a democratic vision, but it was perhaps a certain kind of proto-legalistic constitutionalist vision. So in the 1920s, when many scholars came together in assemblies to debate the caliphate at a point of crisis, when the caliphate was being abolished or about to be abolished, but before the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood and before really the rise of mass Islamist politics in Muslim countries, before Maududi, before obviously al-Banna. And so you have at this moment a sense in which Muslim scholars found themselves tasked with the project of, first of all, defending the idea that Islam required a political manifestation against Turkish secularism and the secularism of Ali Abdurrazak in Egypt, but also we're still sort of stuck in this notion that Islamic politics is primarily seen through the necessity and the office of the caliphate. And just very briefly, what's important about this moment, what I think anticipates a lot of 20th century Islamist thinking, is their assumption that the legality of the caliphate went all the way down. So on the one hand, they were very, very much open to a certain kind of assumption of sovereignty on the part of the scholars or the people who loose and bind. There was a sense that we represent the ummah. We represent the ummah because of who we are. The ummah does not have to appoint us or delegate this authority to us. Leadership of the ummah falls to us, scholars, elites around the court. It's not limited to traditional scholars, but they certainly have a role. But they were stuck in this kind of paradox, which is the paradox of unity versus legality. Does political unity create legality after the fact, or does a prior kind of moral, legal unity have to precede political unity? So let me just restate that in somewhat less pretentious terms. Can someone come to power through force? Let's say the Sharif of Mecca or somebody like that. Can somebody come to power through force and assert political unity and achieve legality of this order after the fact through a combination of the bay'ah and through application of the Sharia in consultation with the scholars? And somewhat surprisingly, the general answer to that was no. So as anybody that has studied medieval Islamic political thought knows that the answer by and large to that question would have been yes. So for all of our anxiety about ISIS thinking it can come to power through force, and all of our desire to claim that there's an invented tradition of consensus through such things as shura or the bay'ah, no Muslim political authority ever came to power through pure consensus, with the possible exception of the first two caliphs, maybe three. So the idea that consensus is achieved through reason, through persuasion, and through legal procedures, and that this is a precondition for the exercise of military force, is a remarkable kind of assumption. Now, whether or not, the important thing is not whether this represents an accurate description of the pre-Islamic tradition, but the important thing is that it represents a certain kind of aspiration, that Muslims should be united before somebody comes to power, that Muslim unity is the efficient Aristotelian cause of a caliph, and not the other way around. And this, I think quite interestingly, mimics certain kinds of Marxist debates at the same time. Does a socialist order come about when the working class has already achieved consciousness and when the revolution happens organically, or rather, does the working class come to power through a Leninist kind of revolution, and then consciousness and unity follows through political force? So the important thing here is twofold. One, that when you look at the arguments of somebody like Ridda and other people that were arguing about the caliphate at the time, they were much more comfortable with the idea that the scholars, the people who loose and bind, could usurp sovereign authority than they were that some kind of traditional sultan could, but that this also created a certain kind of deadlock. It's an infinite regress. If you can't affirm a caliph until everybody is united, then you have to look at the causes of division. And then very often the causes of division were simply the fact of division. We are separated into different countries. There's already been the creation of nation states. We already are obedient to rulers. So there's no way of getting to political unity that was itself a precondition for moral and shari'i or sharia unity. So that's a certain kind of background context. And then, I don't want to exaggerate this, but by and large, the idea that the urgency of Islamic politics was about restoring the caliphate kind of went away. It was about revolution in individual countries or restoring the Sharia through various kinds of means in individual countries. Now, let's jump forward again to 2013, 2014. And what you find in the debates between the so-called Islamic State and al-Qaeda is a very, very predictable focus on a certain kind of Sharia legality. So the texts issued by the Islamic State-affiliated scholars tend to be concerned with elaborating detailed theories of their own legitimacy rather than elaborate theories of statecraft or explorations of the division of different kinds of legal authorities within Islamic State. They're primarily concerned with establishing the validity of their basic claims to have reestablished a caliphate. So these texts are primarily concerned with technical juridical issues around the status of the caliphate and the various legal requirements for its validity. In refuting what they regard as specious objections, shubuhat, to their claims, and here they are only concerned with the arguments from scholars affiliated with al-Qaeda or other Salafi jihadi groups, their sole objective is to vindicate the claim to have established the caliphate, not to explore more complex constitutional questions. The primary points of law that surface in these texts are the following. One, that the office of the caliphate is a permanent religious obligation on the Muslim ummah. This is not an option, it's not a suggestion, it's not an ijtihadi point. This was established through ijma during the time of the Sahaba, and this remains an obligation as long as the Sharia remains an obligation. Now, this is not really a point of dispute. All al-Qaeda or Salafi scholars would agree with this. And it's not clear, by the way, how many other kinds of Islamist scholars or traditionalist Azhari-type scholars would disagree with the point of principle that the caliphate should be reestablished. Two, they're concerned with establishing the eligibility of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi for the office in principle because he fulfills all of the classical conditions or shurut for the caliphate, the 10 classical conditions. And three, and here's the most interesting part, and here's the part that I think is the most complex for theoretical and legal purposes, that his election satisfies all of the conditions of validity. Needless to say, that third is by far the most controversial and opens up the most complex derivative questions. The juridical questions on which the answer to three hinges, that is Baghdadi a legitimate caliph, hinges on 5 subsequent questions. 1, who today are the people who loose and bind that can choose a leader for the entire Muslim community? 2, what kind of prior consultation or shura and subsequent consensus about the caliph is required for validity? 3, how many electors are required for the valid appointment of a caliph? 4, whether Baghdadi and the Islamic State satisfied the external condition for a valid caliphate, the external condition being sufficient territorial consolidation, temkeen in Islamic law, based on sufficient force or shauka. And E, whether fully valid legal caliphates can begin not in election by the people who loose and bind, but in conquest. So basically, just to, I'm probably running out of time, but to summarize this very quickly, what the Islamic State will argue is, they sort of will argue in the affirmative to all of these questions, and like good Supreme Court constitutional lawyers, they will also argue in the alternative. So they will say, and this is very interesting, who are the people who loose and bind today for the Muslim world? Now, this is a very, very interesting question because when you go back to these 1920s debates, you had the Caliphate Congress in Cairo and you had many other efforts. They made an effort to be as inclusive as possible. They said it's the scholars primarily that are the people who loose and bind. This is why this was not a democratic vision. It was perhaps an Islamic legalistic vision. But they tried to include as many scholars from as many countries as possible. They wanted Shiite scholars. They wanted Zaydi scholars. They wanted Ismaili scholars. I don't know about Ahmadis at that time. They wanted scholars from as many lands as possible. So now, it's well known that there's always going to be some kind of paradox of inclusivity. Somebody may have been left out or somebody participated but was overwhelmed through majority decision. But nonetheless, the basic principle there was a kind of a broad tent approach to scholarship. Scholarship or knowledge, ilm, is what authorizes the right to speak on behalf of the Muslim community, but this ilm should be understood in the broadest possible sense. Now, who are the people that loose and bind from the standpoint of the Islamic State? Well, basically, it's their Shura Council. So they are the people, in fact, they refer to themselves as is well known, I think Dr. Shahin mentioned this, Qutb and others sort of repurposed this Leninist idea of a vanguard, a tali'a, as the sort of the Islamist party that can come to power on behalf of others. And in fact, IS documents often refer to themselves as the Tali'a Mujahida, the fighting vanguard of the Islamic community, and that they have earned their own legitimacy by a combination of pure doctrine. Their aqidah is pure because it comes from the Salafi Wahhabi tradition, and that they are guilty of none of the nullifiers of Islam, but also that they have earned the right to speak for the Muslim community by being the only ones that have actually taken the initiative not only to fight the Americans, but also to liberate Muslim lands. So they have established a certain kind of territory. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi fulfills all the conditions, and they give biographies of him. He's definitely male. He is probably not a slave. He has a PhD in tajweed or something, which I guess is good enough. So anyway, they go on and they elaborate his conditions that he is eligible for the caliphate. What's complicated is his election. So again, they will very often argue that because the Shura Council of the Islamic State of Iraq, then the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, is the legitimate representative of the entire Muslim community, that their election is sufficient in terms of authority and numbers and validity for the election of a caliph. But they also, okay, then they will say there are externals, but we have in fact liberated as much territory as the Prophet ever held. So we actually control more square kilometers than the Prophet did. Of course, they don't stop to ask the question, what percentage of Muslim territory did the Prophet govern, as opposed to what percentage of Muslim territories their square mileage counts for. But nonetheless, they say we have established temkeen, or territorial consolidation, on as much territory as the early caliphs did. So you can't say that this is insufficient. But what's interesting is that they also argue in the alternative. And the question raised is, can a legitimate caliphate come to power through sheer force, not through election? And while they have just argued that we actually came to power through a legitimate election, they will also say that, with famous scholars like Juwayni, that yes, in the absence of a legitimate caliphate, as you might say, in times of exception, where you have a legitimate political authority in abeyance, that gap has to somehow be fulfilled. You can't allow a state of illegality or a state of exception to persist for very long. And we Muslims are in a state of exception, not only because we don't have a caliph, right? That could happen very easily, but you have a continuity of elites that can produce a new one. We live in a time of exception where all of the institutions that could produce a valid caliphate are also in abeyance. And that has to be created, and that has to be created through force. So you see a very interesting, as a theoretical matter, I have no special authority on this, it's worth asking, is this kind of discourse inside or outside of law? How do we understand Islamic law in this sense? If they say we can come to power through force and assert our will, and our power becomes legitimate after the fact because of who we are and what we do, and because of the fact that nobody else is doing this, is that a kind of Sharia illegality? Is it saying that sometimes you have to act outside of the law in a kind of Machiavellian, Dick Cheney, Carl Schmitt kind of sense? Or is it in fact saying that perhaps this is actually an ironic echo of what Dr. Shahin was saying, that the Sharia is a blanket that covers all Muslim action. Sometimes it takes the form of the application of specific rules, but sometimes it takes the form of the application of actions when the rules undermine the overall purpose. And it raises the question, is there ever an outside of the Sharia once you're operating with actors who believe themselves to be committed to it? What is the boundary between Sharia as the application of norms and laws that are textually justified, and what is Sharia as the pursuit of discretionary judgment in defense of an overall legal, social, moral, religious order? So that, I think, is the very interesting debate that comes out of the Al-Qaeda Islamic State debate. So Al-Qaeda will argue in response that you have established a fake caliphate because you didn't consult with anybody. You did this on your own. Well, then you ask, who does Al-Qaeda think that the Islamic State should have consulted with? Well, obviously, only them. So they also, it's interesting that we have now survived to live in a time where Al-Qaeda have become the moderates, right? Sort of the good Muslims in this debate over who are the bad Muslims, in which they say that all you have done is divide the Muslim community. In asserting the caliphate, you now assert that all Muslims have an obligation to be loyal to you. So now Muslims, instead of fighting the enemy, are fighting themselves over whether they should give bay'ah or not. So you've created fitna, and you did this entirely on the authority of your own small group. So Usaama gave a bunch of wonderful vituperative statements that Islamic scholars throw at one another. When al-Qaeda really wants to get vituperative and insulting toward the Islamic State, they will go so far as to call them a jama'ah, a group. Isn't that insulting? Because what it really means is you are just one group out of many. You are not the caliphate. You are not the state. You are just the group that calls itself the Islamic State. But I think, obviously I will say this for the cameras, nobody in this room cares about who is right between the Islamic State and al-Qaeda, because nobody's personal loyalties rides on the outcome of that debate. But it does raise, I think, some fascinating questions that have plagued Islamic political thought, at least since the end of the Ottoman Caliphate, which is, what is the ultimate source of legality? Is it a prior consensus that emerges out of consent and persuasion and legality? Or does it emerge out of an initial act of force and will that is then legitimated after the fact? So there's a micro debate between the Islamic State and al-Qaeda over that ever-shrinking piece of land between Iraq and Syria. But that broader question is something that you do see throughout all, I think, Islamic constitutional discourses. And what I think is, at the very least, honest about these Islamic State debates is the recognition of a certain kind of political situation. So for all of the texts that both of my predecessors mentioned, that were written, very often there's an abstract notion, right? What are the public freedoms in Islamic State? What is the power of the Wali al-Amr? But less often, I think, was serious juridical and intellectual attention paid to the fact of what are the steps from a Sharia perspective in getting from one situation to the other. What kinds of really existing authorities need to be obeyed and for what kinds of reasons, and what kinds of founding moments are needed in this particular moment. To what extent is the Muslim community living a period of continuity of a moral imagined community, and to what extent is it living in rupture outside of a state of legality that requires new kinds of radical foundings? And so at the very least, I would suggest that the debates between the Islamic State and al-Qaeda are paying attention to things that traditionally have been at the center of Islamic constitutional thought and never actually go away. Thank you.